Medieval folklore is a strange and unsettling landscape, a world shaped by dim candlelight, superstitions, and the quiet fear that something hidden might be watching from just beyond the tree line. To fall asleep to the stories of this era is to sink slowly into an atmosphere where the familiar rhythms of life were always touched by mystery. In medieval Europe, people lived closer to darkness and silence than we do today. And these conditions nurtured imaginations that filled the world with spirits, omens, and creatures that hovered somewhere between belief and dream. Folklore traveled from mouth to mouth in cottages and marketplaces, shifting slightly each time it was told. It was not written down but woven into daily life, becoming the background hum of existence in a time without scientific explanation. Villagers listened attentively to elders who recounted tales of creatures lurking in forests, of wandering souls, of signs sent by forces that could not be explained. These beliefs, disturbing as they may seem now, offered reassurance. If the world was dangerous, at least it had meaning, and if misfortune struck, there was a pattern behind it. As you drift into the slow rhythm of this narration, imagine sitting by a hearth in a stone cottage, hearing the distant wind press against wooden shutters, and feeling the weight of these old stories settling around you like a blanket woven from shadows. One of the most persistent features of medieval folklore was the belief in spirits that watched over villages. People assumed that every place, every river, and every patch of forest had its own invisible resident. These spirits were not always malicious, but neither were they entirely friendly. They were unpredictable, like weather patterns that could not be measured or controlled. Travelers avoided certain crossroads at night, believing that restless souls lingered there, waiting to mislead the living. The idea of the wild hunt, a spectral procession of ghostly riders thundering across the sky, haunted many regions. The sound of distant storms was sometimes interpreted as the hunt passing overhead, and the advice was simple: remain indoors. Extinguish your fire, and do not draw attention to yourself. What is fascinating is how these tales acted as a social guide, enforcing caution, humility, and respect for nature. When a storm raged or the woods felt unusually quiet, people felt the presence of these forces, and though they were frightened, they felt less alone. These supernatural explanations helped them cope with the unpredictability of life, where illness, accidents, and hunger could strike without warning. Medieval folklore also took shape in the form of creatures that embodied moral lessons. Take the willow, the wisp, a faint light said to hover over marshes at night. People believed it was a mischievous spirit that lured travelers off safe paths and into dangerous terrain. The real explanation, gases rising from decaying plants that ignited spontaneously, was unknown to them, so they crafted a story that served as a warning. Stay on the road, do not wander after dark, and respect the boundary between the known and the unknown. There were also tales of changelings, fairy creatures said to swap human babies with their own. Any infant who cried too much or developed slowly might be suspected of being a changeling, a belief that reflected both the fear of the supernatural and the lack of understanding about early childhood illness. These stories could be disturbing, but they also provided families with a framework for making sense of tragedies that would otherwise be unbearable. In communities where infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, magical explanations softened the emotional burden, turning personal suffering into part of a larger cosmic pattern. The forests of medieval Europe were especially fertile ground for disturbing folklore. People rarely ventured deep into the woods unless they had to. Dense, dark, and filled with unfamiliar sounds, forests felt like a separate world, a place where the rules of human society no longer held sway. Stories of forest spirits, monstrous animals, and witch-like beings circulated widely. These figures often embodied anxieties about isolation, scarcity, and survival. For example, the idea of a forest, which living alone in a hut represented the fear of exile from community and the dangers of self-sufficiency. In a time when cooperation meant survival, wolves, too, played a central role in medieval imagination. Though real wolves did exist, their presence became magnified until they were seen not just as animals, but as symbols of chaos, hunger, and the wilderness itself. Tales of werewolves, humans who transformed into wolves by night, reflected the fear of losing control, of becoming something wild and dangerous. In stories told by firelight, these creatures did not simply frighten listeners. They formed a shared emotional landscape, a way of expressing the tension between the safety of the village and the vast unknown beyond its borders. Even everyday life was touched by strange beliefs. Medieval people observed omens constantly, interpreting the world through signs and symbols. If a bird flew into a house, if a candle flickered unexpectedly, or if a dog howled at night, people looked for meaning. These signs could be warnings or reassurances, depending on the circumstances. Dreams were also taken seriously. A dream of water might symbolize change, while a dream of fire might suggest conflict. People believed that dreams allowed the soul to wander, encountering forces that could influence waking life. It is easy today to dismiss such interpretations as superstition. But in a world with limited literacy and no scientific framework, symbolism helped structure reality. To fall asleep in medieval times was to enter a space where the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual one blurred. And waking up meant returning from that mysterious realm with new impressions to interpret. Sleep itself was a kind of folklore, a nightly journey into the unknown. Another unsettling aspect of medieval folklore was the belief in the physical presence of demons. Illnesses of the mind or body, seizures, fevers, and inexplicable pain were often attributed to demonic forces. Priests and healers developed rituals to ward off these entities, blending religion with older pagan practices. People wore protective charms, carried herbs believed to repel evil, and recited prayers against unseen threats. Though frightening, these practices gave people a sense of agency. Instead of feeling helpless against disease or misfortune, they had tool stories, symbols, rituals that framed their struggle as part of an ongoing battle between good and evil. This gave emotional structure to hardship, turning fear into something that could be addressed, even if only symbolically. Folklore also shaped how medieval people viewed the natural world. Rivers were imagined as dwelling places of nymphs or water spirits. Mountains were the homes of giants, and fields were guarded by harvest spirits who needed to be respected for crops to grow. These beings were often neither good nor bad. They were simply part of the landscape. People made offerings at certain times of the year, whispered thanks after good harvests, and avoided actions believed to anger these spirits. These practices might seem quaint now, but they reveal a mindset in which the environment was alive and responsive. This worldview cultivated respect for nature, because damaging the land was not just a physical act, but a spiritual offense. Even the changing seasons carried layers of meaning. Winter was not merely cold weather, it was the temporary triumph of dark forces, a time when spirits roamed more freely and when people stayed close to the hearth. Spring was a return to balance, celebrated with rituals that blended Christian and pagan traditions. These rhythms created a psychological structure that helped people endure the hardships of life with patience. As you let these stories settle softly in your mind, you may begin to understand why medieval folklore feels both disturbing and strangely comforting. It emerged from a world that was raw, unpredictable, and deeply connected to the cycles of nature. People filled the darkness with meaning because they had to, because the unexplained was too powerful to leave nameless. Folklore offered explanations for the unexplainable and provided emotional grounding in times of fear and uncertainty. Though the world today is far more illuminated, something in these old stories still resonates. They reflect a universal human tendency to seek patterns, to give shape to mystery, and to find comfort in shared imagination. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, imagine those long-ago nights where villagers gathered near the fire, listening to tales shaped by centuries of wonder and worry. In that ancient world of shadows and superstition, they found a sense of belonging. And in the gentle drift of sleep, you can drift there too, resting in the quiet rhythm of stories older than memory.